All right, well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to week number 7 for PPA 500. I hope everyone's doing well and you're having a good week so far. This is our 7th session, so as you know, our course officially ends 1 week from tonight, next Wednesday on October 12th, and that will then culminate with the submission of your final assessment. But before we get to that point in time, we still have one major topic we need to cover, and we will do that tonight, the management of resources. And we'll break it up into 2 different parts. We'll look at how we manage human resources and then how we manage financial resources. And again, we look at the management of human and financial resources within the context of the functions of public administrators. And so throughout the course, we talked about the discipline of public administration. We've talked about how it's grown and evolved as a discipline. Talked about some big differences between public and private sector organizations. We've talked about the role of public administrators in policy formation, policy implementation, policy execution, and then policy evaluation. So tonight what we need to do is finish up our discussion of the primary functions of public administrators by talking about how they manage resources within public organizations. Once we finish this material tonight, you'll then have all the information that you need to do an outstanding job on your final assessment, which again then is due by midnight next Wednesday. So what I thought we would do is make tonight our final live Zoom session. And then next week, rather than having a live Zoom session next Wednesday, I'll just give you that time to work on your final assessment. I will be available during class time next week. If you have any questions about the final assessment, you can always email those to me, and I'll be available to answer those questions for you. But we'll make tonight our last Zoom session, and then next Wednesday will be technically our final exam. You'll just have time to work on the final assessment. Thank you for your posts on the discipline of public administration. I've graded all of those. I did not provide feedback on those because I had already graded that in your midterm assessment, so I thought it was kind of redundant to give you feedback on the discussion board post as well. But again, you could have taken either position, either that yes, public administration is a discipline or it's a subfield within another academic discipline. As long as you justified your answer, that was certainly then sufficient. Then also, not only next week do you have your final assessment due next Wednesday, but next Tuesday by midnight, you also then have your 5th and final beach board posting due. For that beach board number 5, what you'll be doing is selecting a public policy that you are familiar with. And it can be any public policy at all, just something you're familiar with or something that you're interested in. It could be housing policy. It could be, it could be welfare policy. It could be any policy that you're interested in. And then select a specific aspect of that. And so, for instance, you might want to look at, if you're interested in voting rights, you might want to look at the Voting Rights Act and the policy of anti-discrimination in voting. If you're interested in housing, you might want to look at something like portable vouchers in housing or something like that. And then you select that issue, that policy, and then discuss which of our 4 decision-making models that we had talked about when we talked about public policy you think are best, or you think is best represented by how that policy emerged and how that policy was formulated and developed. So remember, those 4 different decision-making models that you're going to choose from are rational comprehensive, incrementalism, mixed scanning, and the garbage can model decision-making. So if the policy you're looking at is an abrupt and major change from the way in which we handled that policy area in the past, there could be some rationality involved there, in that we took into account a lot of different types of perspectives, a lot of information, considered a lot of different alternatives before selecting this policy alternative as the one that we were going to fund as our public policy. If the policy you're looking at is just a very small, marginal change from the way in which we always pursued that policy, then it's probably going to reflect incrementalism. If you see a combination of both rationality and incrementalism, then you're probably looking at something more like mixed scanning, the combination of the two. If you see this confluence of the right people in decision-making positions, along with a well-defined problem and a pre-existing solution, and then some type of a triggering event that opens up a policy window opportunity, then you might recognize that as being garbage can model decision making. So what type of decision making model was used in putting this policy together, and why you think it was that decision making model? And then is there another decision making model that you think would have worked better in the formulation of that public policy? So again, that's kind of our policy oriented type of discussion board. That's discussion board number 5. As always, respond to 2 classmates, and then those responses are then due, as always, by next Tuesday by midnight. But last week we went over the final assessment. I walked you through all the different scenarios in that final assessment, so you should be pretty familiar with what the final assessment looks like. Again, on that final assessment, you are being parsimonious, concise in your answers. So, 1 or 2 paragraphs per question will certainly suffice. And again, there's not a right or wrong answer for any of the questions. It's how well you justify your answer. And then the final assessment will be due by midnight next Wednesday. I'll grade all of that, hopefully on next Thursday if everything goes well, and then have your final grades ready to upload into the system, hopefully by next Friday. This class will then be in the rearview mirror, and you can then move onward and upward with your future classes. So that's where we stand currently and what we look like going forward for our next week together. Are there any questions or anything about where we are and what we're doing? All right, well, seeing that we are all good, let's go ahead and delve into our topic for tonight, which is going to wrap up our information on the management of resources. Let's see, will the beach board materials for this be available after next week? That's a good question. For these courses, usually the university will keep the course open through usually about 2 or 3 weeks after the end of the class. So this one probably will, I would assume the material should be available through the beginning of November, would be my guess. So yes, they should be available after the class. And since we're a hybrid class, sometimes the university doesn't catch up with that. And so sometimes our courses are actually available all the way through the end of the semester. But I think to be safe, I would say by the beginning of November, you should still have this access to the class. And then sometime in November, you may see it go away. Good question. Okay, so throughout the course, one of the major themes that we have continued to touch upon, the differences between public and private sector, and the differences between public managers and private managers, the difference between public organizations and private sector organizations. In our reading of Graham Allison, we know that Graham Allison told us that's not really the functions of management that differ between the sectors, but rather it's how those functions are carried out. So how public administrators manage human resources will be different than how they do it in the private sector. How public managers manage financial resources will be different than how those financial resources are managed over in the private sector. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to talk about some of the specific details of how we manage human and financial resources. And we'll start the first half of class tonight doing the management of human resources. We'll then take a break. And then the second half of class, we'll turn our attention to the management of financial resources. So when we're talking about managing human resources in the public sector, we know that the primary difference between public human resource management and private human resource management is that in public human resource management, we're dealing with civil service employees who are afforded certain civil service protections, meaning that they cannot be dismissed for political reasons. They can't be sanctioned and dismissed because of a whim on the part of management or leadership. Their jobs are protected. And so the only time they can be sanctioned, disciplined, or terminated would be for cause, that there's something that they're doing in their job that is not being effective and not being productive. But even then, in sanctioning and disciplining public employees, you have to have multiple instances of subpar performance. So you have to do a rigorous job of documenting performance evaluations and have multiple performance evaluations that document subpar performance. And then after each one of those subpar performance evaluations, you then also have to document that you provided the opportunity for training and development to help them develop whatever skills would then help them be more productive as employees. So those are those civil service types of protections we deal with in the public sector. Private sector, as you know, our employees are at-will employees, which means they're hired at will, they're retained at will, they're sanctioned and terminated at will as well. So that's the huge difference between managing human resources in the public versus the private sector. But before we get into some of the specifics about how you manage human resources in the public sector, I think we need to talk about the development of human resource management, especially at the federal level, and talk about the history of federal employment and where our current civil service system came from. So there have been three primary eras of employment in the United States. The first era was known as the era of gentlemen. And the era of gentlemen runs from the founding of the nation up into the 1820s, and specifically up to the election of Andrew Jackson as president. So during the era of gentlemen, we hired people to work in the federal government based upon essentially who they were and their station in society. We wanted to hire people who would build legitimacy in government so that people would look at this new fledgling national government and say it's legitimate because look at the quality of the people they have working in these federal organizations, these federal agencies. So in the era of gentlemen, we hired people essentially based upon who they were. And we did that to make government legitimate. Today we go to bed at night, we wake up in the morning and we expect the US government will always be there. In the late 1700s, there was not that expectation. A lot of people expected the new fledgling national government to be gone in a number of years or even a couple of decades. And so we had to add that legitimacy to people's viewpoint of the federal government. So we hired people based on who they were in the era of gentlemen. Then in 1824, we had this watershed election that came to be known as the corrupt bargain. In 1824, we had multiple candidates running for the presidency. The three main candidates were John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, and Henry Clay from the state of Kentucky, the Speaker of the House. What we ended up with in the election of 1824 is that Andrew Jackson got more popular votes than John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay. Andrew Jackson also got more electoral college votes than John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay. The problem, though, was that Andrew Jackson did not get a majority of the electoral college votes. We know, according to the Constitution, whenever no one gets a majority of electoral college votes, the election then goes into the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives will then select the president with each delegation, each state delegation getting one vote. So irrespective of how many representatives you have from your state in the House of Representatives, California would get one vote, Ohio gets one vote, Florida gets one vote, Delaware gets one vote. Each congressional delegation gets one vote for their state. And so you then have the House of Representatives electing the president or selecting the president. The problem was, and the reason why it became known as the corrupt bargain, John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay worked out an arrangement whereby Henry Clay would get his states that were dedicated to supporting him to support John Quincy Adams, and in exchange, John Quincy Adams would then appoint Henry Clay as a Secretary of State. So that was the corrupt bargain. So Henry Clay, through his support and his states, then supported John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams was then selected as president by the House of Representatives, even though Andrew Jackson won more electoral votes and won more popular votes. John Quincy Adams becomes president. Once John Quincy Adams is president, he then nominates Henry Clay to be Secretary of State, hence the term the corrupt bargain. Obviously, that corrupt bargain angered a lot of people, especially Andrew Jackson. And so then in the subsequent election in 1828, we had a rematch between then now incumbent president John Quincy Adams and challenger Andrew Jackson. And in 1828, Andrew Jackson won a majority of both the popular as well as the electoral vote, and very healthy majorities, both popular as well as in the electoral college. So Andrew Jackson then wins the election of 1828, primarily based upon his complaints about the corrupt bargain from 1824. So when Andrew Jackson comes into the White House in 1828, Andrew Jackson brings with him this belief in partisanship and ushers in this new era of employment called the era of spoils, or sometimes known as the era of patronage. To the victor go the spoils. And so the winning political party then has the opportunity to dole out government jobs as a reward for people who supported them when they ran for office. To the victor go the spoils. And so we get this era of spoils, where you got your job not based upon who you were, but you got your job based upon who you knew. Did you support the winning candidate? Did you support the winning political party? If so, then you get the spoils of that. You get jobs that are given to you by that winning candidate and that winning political party. The advantage of an era of spoils is that it creates a great deal of loyalty. So that if you're getting your job from the political party or you're getting your job from the winning candidate, you're obviously going to be very loyal to that party and to that candidate. So it creates a lot of party loyalty. The disadvantage, obviously, is that the only qualification some of these folks had for a government position was the mere fact that they supported the winning candidate or the winning political party. There is no measurement of their qualifications and their skills, their knowledge, skills, and ability to be able to actually do the job after the job was given to them. So you have a lot of incompetence, you had a lot of corruption. Earlier on, when we talked about accountability and ethics, I read that portion to you from George Washington Plunkett, his Plunkett of Tammany Hall memoirs, about how there is honest graft and there is nothing wrong with using your public position for private gain. And we saw a lot of that, not just at the federal level in the era of spoils, but also with these political machines at the local government level, much like what we saw in New York City with the political machine of Tammany Hall. So as we run from 1828 up until the 1880s, government hiring was done based upon this era of patronage, era of spoils. You got your job based upon who you knew. Did you support the right political party and the right candidate? Then as we get into the early 1880s, we had a triggering event like you see in garbage can model decision making. And that big triggering event was the assassination of President Garfield. So Garfield wins the election in 1880, assumes the White House, and then very shortly after that, in 1881, he is then assassinated by an assassin by the name of Charles J. Guiteau. Guiteau had written a few political speeches for Garfield when he was a candidate for presidency. There's no evidence whatsoever that Garfield ever used any of those speeches, ever read any of those speeches, or even ever knew of the existence of Charles J. Guiteau. But Guiteau reasoned that, well, this is the era of spoils. I wrote these speeches. I helped Garfield get elected to the presidency, and so Garfield should then appoint me ambassador to France. A very reasonable type of expectation. Just ambassador to France, not a big job, just ambassador to France, a job that almost everyone wants. Obviously, Garfield did not appoint him ambassador to France. He didn't appoint him to any position. So Guiteau thought what he would do is he would assassinate Garfield. And by assassinating Garfield, he would then clear the way for Garfield's vice president, Chester Arthur, who is a big party loyalist and a big believer in spoils and patronage, to then become president. And then when Chester Arthur became president, Chester Arthur would then reward Charles Guiteau for basically clearing the path for him to become president. And then that's how Charles J. Guiteau would get his job as ambassador to France. Again, not very rational thinking, but that was kind of the thinking that Guiteau used. Guiteau then went out and assassinated James Garfield. That assassination was the triggering event that allowed a gentleman in Congress by the name of Pendleton, and you see his name, his picture up on the screen, George Pendleton, who had for years been carrying around in his pocket draft legislation to get rid of the era of spoils and usher in an era of merit. where we would start hiring people not based on their political affiliation, but rather we would start hiring people based upon their knowledge, skills, and abilities, their ability to do the job they're being hired for. Pendleton wasn't getting anywhere with his legislation until this assassination of Garfield. That thing galvanized public opinion around the idea that we need to get rid of this era of spoils. We need to get politics out of the hiring of government employees, and we need to hire them based upon merit. Pendleton introduced his legislation into Congress, got his legislation passed, and signed into law known as the Pendleton Act. So in 1883, when George Pendleton gets his Pendleton Act signed into law, this Pendleton Act is then what ushers in an era of merit, whereby we're going to hire people based upon their qualifications rather than hire them based upon their political affiliation. Today, the vast majority of our hiring in the public sector is usually geared around this era of merit, in that we will either give people examinations, we'll review their resume to look at their knowledge, skills, and abilities, but we'll have some measures that we can use to assess the qualifications of someone before they get a job working in a government organization. And that's true for the vast majority of government employees. But at the very top echelons of our departments and our agencies, we still have those departments and agencies led by political appointees. So we still have at the very top of our organizations those upper level leadership positions, the secretaries of departments, the directors of federal agencies. Those individuals are still nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate. So there's still vestiges of the era of spoils in terms of those few employees at the very top of our organizations. But 99% of everyone else who works in government organizations get their jobs based upon their knowledge, skills, and abilities. They get their job based upon the era of merit. So the Pendleton Act was passed way back in 1883. In that Pendleton Act, what we are essentially saying that people cannot be sanctioned or dismissed based upon their political affiliations. You cannot use politics to make employment decisions. But by the time we get up into the 1930s, we realize that we are giving people these protections from political influence, but we're not really requiring anything from them in return. And there's a lot of concern about people using their government office to campaign for political parties and to campaign for specific candidates. And the idea was, if we are going to protect them from political reprisal, then we should expect these employees to then also refrain from using their government resources for political purposes. And that's what then led to the Hatch Act. So in 1939, we get the passage of this thing called the Hatch Act that essentially says that if you're a government employee, you may not use your resources, your office, any type of publicly paid for resources, your time while you're in office. You can't use any of those public resources in any type of campaigning or electioneering type of activities. So we're now requiring that if we're going to give you these political protections, we're going to require you to avoid practicing politics when you are on the job using public resources. And that's what's known as the Hatch Act. The Hatch Act was done at the national level, but in the wake of the Hatch Act, all different states and the vast majority of states passed their own what were called Little Hatch Acts, which would kind of mirror the limitations on federal employees and place those same limitations on state and local employees as well. And here in California, we have our own Little Hatch Act, and our Little Hatch Act, the PRA, limits the types of political things you can do while you are in a government office. So that's the change that we made in the 1930s and throughout the 1940s. The states adopted their own Little Hatch Acts. Fast forward into the 1970s. So once we get into the 1970s, we are almost 100 years removed from the beginnings of the era of merit and the passage of the Pendleton Act back in 1883. The problem is, over those subsequent 100 years, what had happened is we had made some changes to the Pendleton Act, and we had overlaid rules and regulations on top of what we originally had with the Pendleton Act. And we had created this very confusing patchwork of laws whereby managers as well as employees were unclear about exactly what they could and could not do while in this era of merit with merit-based hiring. So in 1978, in the Carter administration, we get this huge sweeping piece of legislation called the Civil Service Reform Act, which was a major reform of the Pendleton Act to update the Pendleton Act to try and clarify everyone's roles and responsibilities when it came to the promotion of merit-based principles. And remember, when we talk merit-based principles, we're not just talking about merit-based hiring, we're talking about merit-based retention in office, and we're talking about merit-based dismissal as well, that you can only be dismissed for cause. So in this Civil Service Reform Act, we decided to create a bunch of different agencies to help us better manage the career civil service system at the federal level. And again, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this because you'll probably cover this in your 577 Human Resource Management class, but some of the agencies created were OPM, the Office of Personnel Management. The Office of Personnel Management was charged with being the central clearinghouse for all personnel-related issues in the entire federal government. So kind of like the OBM, the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, handles the financial issues. OPM, the Office of Personnel Management, handles personnel issues. And so at least when the Civil Service Reform Act was passed, OPM had the responsibility for writing descriptions, creating examinations, administering those examinations, scoring those examinations, creating eligibility lists to provide to agencies, to tell agencies which employees were eligible to be interviewed. All that was done by the Office of Personnel Management. Then the second organization was created is the MSPB, which stands for the Merit Systems Protection Board, the Merit Systems Protection Board. And the goal of the Merit Systems Protection Board was to protect people's merit, their merit-based hiring and merit-based retention. So if someone felt that they were being sanctioned or disciplined for political reasons, or any type of non-causal reason, they could then file a claim with the Merit Systems Protection Board. In very much of a quasi-judicial type of an approach, the Merit System Protection Board would then investigate that claim, would hold hearings on that claim, and would then render a decision about whether or not that claim was meritorious. Did the agency use political reasoning in order to have some detrimental impact upon this employee? Did this organization do something to violate the merit principles for this individual employee? Within the Merit Systems Protection Board, there's also an office created known as the Office of Special Counsel. And it's counsel like a lawyer, so it's SEL instead of CIL. So it's the Office of Special Counsel. The Office of Special Counsel was created if an employee saw a violation of merit going on within their organizations, but that violation did not affect that individual employee. It affected someone else in the organization. Then that employee could blow the whistle to the Office of Special Counsel. The Office of Special Counsel would then go and investigate that claim, and just like with the Merit Systems Protection Board, the Office of Special Counsel would then render a decision. So again, the difference is if you're the one who's having your merit principles violated, you go to the Merit Systems Protection Board. If you're blowing the whistle on it's happening to someone else in your organization, then you go to the Office of Special Counsel. The problem with the Office of Special Counsel is that it became overwhelmed with case log immediately. I mean, there were just cases upon cases upon cases, and it didn't have its own budget in order to hire enough employees to review all those cases. So in 1990, in the Whistleblower Act, we took the Office of Special Counsel out of the Merit Systems Protection Board and made it its own standalone agency with its own budget so that it could go out there and pursue all of these claims of merit-based violations. Then a fourth organization that was created is the Federal Labor Relations Authority, the FLRA, the Federal Labor Relations Authority. The Federal Labor Relations Authority was charged with the responsibility of overseeing the negotiation and the collective bargaining process across the entire federal government. So whenever employee unions would engage in collective bargaining for new contracts with management, those negotiations would then be overseen by the Federal Labor Relations Authority. The Federal Labor Relations Authority did the same type of oversight in the public sector that the National Labor Relations Board does in the private sector. So similar types of organizations, one for public sector, one for the private sector. The Federal Labor Relations Authority actually ended up developing a poor reputation with federal employees. And one of the reasons why it got a poor reputation is in the beginning of the Reagan administration, back in the early 1980s, we had an air traffic controller strike. So air traffic controllers wanted a raise. They couldn't collectively bargain over that because any type of compensations outside of the scope of bargaining at the federal level, because Congress establishes how much employees get paid in the federal government. So they decided we're going to go on strike. The Reagan administration said, this is a public safety position. We can't have air traffic controllers off the job. So if you go on strike, we will fire you. So he kind of called their bluff. Air traffic controllers went out on strike, immediately fired them, and then hired new people to come in and be trained to become air traffic controllers. Well, obviously, the Air Traffic Controllers Union thought that was an unfair labor practice. They took their case to the Federal Labor Relations Authority. The Federal Labor Relations Authority sided with the Reagan administration, reasoning that air safety is a public safety concern. There aren't many public safety concerns that are more important than airline safety. And so because it's a public safety position, sided with the Reagan administration against the Air Traffic Controllers Union. Whether you agree with that decision or not, what it did is it then created the perception among public employee unions that the FLRA was predisposed toward the president as opposed to being predisposed toward the protection of unions. And then the final organization created, it's known as the Senior Executive Service. Now, earlier we said that the vast majority of the federal bureaucracy is based upon merit principles. You get your job based upon merit, your knowledge, skills, and your abilities. However, we said the very top echelon of leadership in our federal agencies and departments will be made up of political appointees, people who are appointed by the president and then confirmed by the Senate. The problem is that creates a duality in your organizations where you have a gap between your political appointees at the top and all the rest of your employees in the career civil service. That gap is problematic because whenever a new political appointee comes in as a department, secretary of a department or director of an agency, that person is going to bring with them the policy directives from the president. If you're a member of the career civil service in that organization and you do not agree with that policy directive, as a career civil servant, you can just wait it out. You can say, well, this political appointee is going to be here for no more than 4 years, more likely will be here for 18 to 24 months. I'm going to just outwait them. And so I don't like what they're doing. I'm going to be in my position for a career. I'll wait until we get a new agency director or department secretary who I agree with. And so you have this divide that was created between political appointees and the rest of the career civil service. So the Senior Executive Service was created to try and bridge that gap. So what we did is we took the top 3 levels of the career civil service. And let me show you the next screen and you kind of see how this works. We took the top 3 levels, what were known as GS 16, 17, and 18 employees, the very top level of the career civil service, and we put those folks into the Senior Executive Service. The Senior Executive Service was kind of a hybrid type of position. It was not completely career civil service, but it wasn't also a political appointee. Essentially, it made it easier to hire and fire and discipline members of the Senior Executive Service So members of the senior executive service gave up some of their career civil service protections, but in exchange for giving up some of their career civil service protections, they also were then made available to them bonus pay. So the organization operated more effectively. They would get paid extra money for the effectiveness of the organization. It gave them more flexibility in terms of moving between agency and agency that they didn't have that flexibility before. So it's supposed to be a trade-off: more pay, more flexibility, but you give up some of your career civil service protections. And again, the senior executive service, those general schedule 16, 17, and 18 positions were meant to bridge the gap between political appointees and everybody else in those organizations. The problem with the senior executive service, the reason why it hasn't worked that well, is that a lot of those promises of bonus pay that Congress made, Congress didn't then make good on it. That Congress promised bonus pay, but never actually provided that bonus pay to those members of the senior executive service. So in our current system of employment at the federal level, what does that mean? What does our career civil service system look like? Our career civil service system is based upon a system of position classification, where we take every position within the federal bureaucracy and we place it into a general schedule step and pay band within what's called the general schedule. So the career civil service is reflected by a general schedule. The general schedule typically runs from the low of a GS3 up to a high of a GS15. So as you can see on the screen, if you're in a GS3 or GS4 position, these are typically internships or student jobs. And so, coming out of an MPA program, you'd be well above a GS3 or GS4 position. That's at the very bottom of this position classification system. The next rung up would be GS5 through GS7. GS5 through GS7 are mostly entry-level positions, oftentimes positions that don't require any type of advanced degree. Entry-level clerical positions, for example, tend to fall in that GS5 to GS7 type of range. GS8 to GS12 are your mid-level positions. If you're entering into the federal workforce for the first time with an MPA degree, this is probably where you're going to enter, somewhere between GS8 and GS12, likely probably about a GS10 or GS11 type of position if you have an MPA degree. So those are your mid-level types of management positions. GS13 to GS15 are your top-level supervisory positions. And so that's kind of where we max out the career civil service, is up at that GS15 level. Once you get above GS15, so those old GS16, 17, and 18 types of positions, those positions are now part of the senior executive service that was created back in 1978 by the Civil Service Reform Act. These senior executive service positions are no longer GS positions. They are now known as ES positions, executive service positions. And they run from an ES1 to an ES5. So there are now 5 levels of senior executive service, ES1 to ES5. To get into the senior executive service, for people who are in the GS13 to GS15 range, those individuals can then attend an institute that basically training that will train them how to then become part of the senior executive service. So if you're in the GS13 to 15 position, you're interested in going into the executive service, you go to this institute, you do this training, and then you are eligible to eventually be promoted into the senior executive service. So that's the position classification system we have at the federal level that reflects this career civil service type of orientation. The advantages of having a position classification system like this in the public sector is that you can treat people equally, and you can treat people based upon the jobs that they are doing. So you're not going to get paid more just because a supervisor likes you more. You're going to get paid more because your position is classified at a higher level than another position. So as you move down all these different grades, you will then also move down pay grades as well. So the way in which you arrange the general schedule is within each one of these levels. So say, for instance, at the GS 13 level, there are then a series of steps, typically 9 or 10 steps, that each year you move up a step in your GS 13 classification. And eventually, once you've maxed out all those steps, so if you're a GS 13 step 10, you've maxed out your salary unless you can get your position reclassified up to a GS 14 position. If you then get it reclassified up to a GS 14, then you start over with your steps again, and then you can have some upward mobility in terms of your compensation. But we use this type of position classification system to assign compensation, so that people who are doing more difficult jobs, they have supervisory responsibilities, are going to get paid more in compensation than someone who is in an entry-level position down at the GS5 to GS7 level. So it's there for fairness and to treat people in an equitable way in a very uniform type of fashion. Clearly, the disadvantage is that it doesn't afford you a lot of flexibility to do things like pay for performance. So if you have someone who's performing very well in their GS 13 position, but they've maxed out their steps, you can't really use compensation as an incentive. In order to get paid more, you'd have to do a classification study to see whether or not that position has changed substantially enough to then be reclassified up to a GS 14 position. So it does kind of tie your hands as a supervisor in terms of motivating your employees. But that's a big difference in what we see in the private sector, where our employees are at-will employees. They can get bonus pay, they can get commissions, they can get all those types of incentives that are not really available in the system of career civil service we see in the public level. So as a manager in a public organization, as you manage your human resources, you must be very mindful of the impact of a career civil service system and the civil service protections that are afforded to your employees. So if you want to sanction an employee, you're going to have to document poor performance on multiple occasions, and then document that you have offered training and development to that employee on multiple occasions as well. So you're kind of restricted in terms of the civil service protections. You're also restricted in terms of unionization. Now, not every public employee is going to be part of a union, but the vast majority of public employees are part of public employee unions. Unionization will have a big impact upon how you manage your human resources as well. You not only have to know what the Career Civil Service says about civil service protections, but you also have to understand that the collective bargaining agreement, the contract between management and public employee unions, will also place limitations on you in terms of more protections that are being provided to these employees. The whole process of putting a contract together is a process known as collective bargaining, when public employee unions negotiate with management in order to come up with a contract, a series of provisions that will stipulate how people are hired, how work is being allocated, how work is being evaluated, how people are being compensated, how people are being sanctioned and disciplined. All those things will become part of that collective bargaining process that will then result in that contract that will place those limitations on supervisors and managers. Now, the types of issues that are included in this collective bargaining process, when bargaining units negotiate with management, will differ depending upon level of government and will differ from state to state as well. There is something known as the permissive scope of bargaining. The permissive scope of bargaining speaks to all the issues that can be collectively bargained over. So all the issues that you can negotiate over are within the permissive scope of bargaining. At the federal level, compensation is not included in the permissive scope of bargaining. Reason for that is that compensation is established by Congress. Congress decides how much employees are going to make in this general schedule. Congress has the ability to increase the pay of federal employees if they would like to. There is a compensation committee commission, I should say, that exists to advise Congress in terms of if a raise is suitable, if a raise is appropriate, and how much that raise should be. And then Congress acts upon that and changes the compensation in the general schedule. But because Congress is establishing compensation, you can't collectively bargain over it because it's within the domain of Congress. So at the federal level, compensation is not within the permissive scope of bargaining. In most states, compensation is within the scope of bargaining for state employees as well as local employees. I'll give you an example of an issue that, from my experience, was not in the scope of bargaining. In fact, many years ago when I was in grad school, I did a study for the Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations where we were looking at the impact of certain federal laws on, for our part of the study, was looking at the impact of federal laws on local education. And one thing that I found out is in the state of Ohio, privatization. So if a school district wants to privatize its transportation services, or its cafeteria services, or its security services, any type of privatization was not within the permissive scope of bargaining. So local bargaining units, employee units, could not collectively bargain over whether or not the district would engage in privatization. So every state has a different scope, permissive scope of bargaining, the types of issues that can be collectively bargained over. Frequently these days, we hear a lot about an impasse. So whenever management and the employee union cannot come to a negotiated agreement through the collective bargaining process, one or both parties can declare an impasse. An impasse means we are no longer able to come to an agreement, a negotiated settlement. Once you have an impasse, you have to break that impasse somehow because you need to get a contract to govern going into the future how the organization is going to deal with its employees. So there are three different ways in which you can try and deal with an impasse, three different strategies for what we call impasse resolution. The first one you see on the screen there is fact finding. So what the parties can do is they can call in an independent third-party fact finder. That fact finder will come in, will then review the bargaining process, and will then produce a fact-finding report. In that fact-finding report, the fact finder will say, this is what the union offered, this is what management offered, and just basically put a report together. That fact finder report, though, can be very important because if in that fact finder report, it reflects very poorly on management, that's going to put some added pressure on management to get back to the bargaining table and to try and come to an agreement because of the bad public relations from how they look in that fact finder's report. So even though the fact finder report is certainly non-binding on both parties, it can put some political pressure on one or the other parties to try and break the impasse and get the negotiation ball rolling again. Fact finder reports are usually not given out to the public and not made public for a couple of weeks. They're what we call embargoed. So they will embargo the fact-finding report for a couple of weeks. So they only go to the employee union and to management. It allows employee union and management to get a first look at the fact-finding report and hopefully come to an agreement before those 2 weeks are up and the fact-finding report then goes out for public consumption. But fact-finding does not guarantee that you're going to break an impasse. It just puts pressure on one or the other sides to come back to the bargaining table. Second mediation is mediation. In mediation, what we'll do is we'll bring in a third party, and the federal government has what it calls the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service. And in the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service, they employ trained mediators who they will then send out whenever there's an impasse someplace in the country. They'll send the mediator out to sit down at the table with the two parties and help them come to a negotiated settlement. When I was in college, one of my political science professors was a mediator employed by the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service, which meant that we didn't have class very often because he was gone for most of the semester off doing his mediation work in various states around the country. Mediation is non-binding, and so it's just to try and help them come to an agreement, but it does not bind either party on any type of a resolution. If you want a resolution, you want to get a contract, then what you need is you need binding arbitration. In binding arbitration, an arbiter is brought in, again, can come from the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service or from the private sector. The arbiter comes in and the arbiter looks at the proposals from both sides. The arbiter in what's called final offer arbitration will take the final offer from the union and the final offer from management and will then select one of those two offers. So either select the union's offer or select management's offer, and then whichever offer the arbiter has selected then becomes the binding agreement. That then becomes the contract, and that ends that portion, that cycle of the collective bargaining process. So if you want to get a resolution to your impasse, if you want to be 100% sure you're going to get a resolution, you choose final offer binding arbitration. But remember, the collective bargaining process is for a contract, and that contract is going to have a sunset provision in it. So that contract may be for a year, or maybe 2 years, or it may be 3 years. But when that contract ends, you then have to go through collective bargaining again to then negotiate another contract, and then so on and so on and so on. So the collective bargaining process is something that's very much ongoing. Also within collective bargaining, there's usually a provision that's known as meet and confer. So if management wants to change the working environment or the work activities of employees, employees can then go to their union and grieve that through their union, and their union can then demand a meet and confer with management, where they'll have to sit down with management at the bargaining table and say, you have fundamentally changed the work requirements of this position, so now we have to bargain over it. This is something that happened frequently during the COVID pandemic. And so we had a lot of remote work that was being done because of COVID, and we had some public employee unions saying, that's changing the requirements of our work. That's changing our work environment. So therefore, we need to have a say in that. And they would then demand a meet and confer with management so that they could bargain and hammer out some of their differences in terms of remote work, how remote work would happen, how remote work would be evaluated, and all those ancillary types of issues. But the important, again, going back to our big question in this class, the big so what question. Well, so what? The big so what here is you not only have this career civil service system, but you also overlay on top of that the collective bargaining process as well. So managers need to know career civil service protections as well as the protections afforded to employees through this collective bargaining process and the contract. What that has meant is it has meant that it's become a much more difficult type of endeavor to manage human resources than it was in the past. So the response of a lot of organizations has been to take the management of human resources away from frontline managers and centralize those functions within an Office of Human Resource Management. Leave it to the human resource professionals and let those decisions come from HR rather than have those decisions made unilaterally by managers and supervisors. So managers and supervisors had to give up some of their powers and some of their ability to manage human resources because of the increased complexity of what it takes to properly manage human resources in a public organization. The good aspect, the upshot of that, is that if you're interested in HR and you want to get a job in the public sector as an HR professional, we have seen human resource management offices increase in size exponentially. And so there are a lot more HR positions available today than there were 20 to 30 years ago. So it's a kind of a cottage industry for people with the MPA. So that kind of creates the context for understanding how we manage human resources as public managers. Now let's get into some of the specific functions that occur within human resource management, some of the specific functions that public leaders engage in when they manage human resources. The first function of human resource management is obviously recruitment. We have to get employees into our organization. We have to get employees with the requisite skill set into our organization if we want to be effective as an organization. This is kind of, again, your systems resource type of model of organizational effectiveness. Are we able to get adequate human resources into our organization and import those types of energies from our external environment. If you worked in the private sector and the public sector, you know that getting a job in the private sector is much different than the public sector. In the private sector, as an at-will employee, you could be hired on the spot. And if they have your paperwork in order, you could go to work right away. In the public sector, it may take you 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, up to a year in order to get hired to work in a public organization. It's a very protracted process because, again, we have to hire people based on their knowledge, skills, and abilities. We have to create a representative bureaucracy, which means that we have to make sure that we have a diverse labor pool. So whenever we put out our notice, we have to make sure that notice for the position announcement has been vetted. Here at Long Beach, we have to have it vetted through the Office of Equity and Diversity, as we had discussed earlier. They vet the announcement, they vet the advertisements. Then whenever the applications come in, they have to make sure that they can vet the applicant pool to make sure that the applicant pool is a diverse enough applicant pool. If the applicant pool is not diverse enough, then that pool will then be disbanded and you'll go out there and re-advertise, repost the position again. If the applicant pool is diverse enough, then you have to have some metrics for deciding who you are going to be interviewing. Again, those individuals you interview, that interviewee pool will then have to be vetted through equity and diversity as well to make sure that it's a diverse enough pool. And again, you'll go through all this in human resource management course, but just kind of underscore all the steps you need to go through in the public sector as compared to the steps you don't have to go through in recruitment in the private sector. Once you have your applicant pool in place, you then have to go through the selection process. You then have to select the employee that you're going to interview and then eventually select the employee that you will hire. In the past, we had a lot of examinations. And if you applied for a federal job 20 or 30 years ago, chances are you took an examination. It was a standardized examination created by the Office of Personnel Management, administered by the Office of Personnel Management, scored by the Office of Personnel Management, and then Office of Personnel Management, based upon the scores on that exam, would then create an eligibility list of either the top 3 or the top 5 scores. The agency could then interview only off of that eligibility list, your top 3, which is known as the rule of 3, or your top 5 scores, known as the rule of 5. But it was really driven by the applicant's performance on that examination. We have found over the years that examinations are oftentimes not that accurate. There are certain cultural biases that are built into examinations that make them less than accurate predictors of future success on the job. We also know there's a lot of validity issues that are associated with examinations as well. There's what's called criterion validity, where the examination, the elements in the examination do not correlate well with the elements of the job itself. There's what's known as predictive validation. So do people who score well on the exam then perform well on the job? And oftentimes they don't. And there's a disconnect between who does well on the exam and who does well once they're hired into the job. So we learned back in the 1970s in a very famous case called Griggs versus Duke Power Company that a lot of examinations were invalid. And they had some serious problems associated with them in that they were not doing an accurate job of predicting who would then be an effective and productive employee. So today on the federal level, we have replaced a lot of these examinations with an examination of knowledge, skills, and abilities. So we'll look at someone's resume, we'll look at their letters of reference, we'll look at their experience and their education, and kind of make a more holistic determination of does this person have the requisite knowledge, skills, and abilities in order to do the job, rather than just how well they perform on an examination. We also tend to use these things called, when we can, assessment centers, where we will simulate a work environment. And then we'll bring our applicants into that simulated work environment. We will then evaluate the work in that work environment as a predictor for how well they'll do the work once they are on the job. Now, we know there are problems with those assessment centers as well. They're very expensive to set up. They're very time consuming. And there is this lovely thing in research that you probably have heard of before called the Hawthorne effect. And the Hawthorne effect says that people will act differently when they're being surveyed, when they're being watched, when they're being viewed. Remember our discussion of the theoretical perspectives in public organizations. We talked about Elton Mayo, the Hawthorne electric plant. That's where the Hawthorne effect came from. So even though assessment centers became very popular a few years ago, they've kind of died out a little bit just because they're so resource intensive and they're not as valid as we would hope they would be because of this Hawthorne type of effect. There are still examinations that exist for certain positions. If you want to go into a computer science type of position with a government agency, there will be an examination that you have to take. The military uses a lot of different examinations as well to hire people into different types of positions. And so there are still examinations used. It's just a lot of those exams have been supplanted with a more holistic review of knowledge, skills, and abilities. And you think about similar to our MPA program and admission to our MPA program, we don't require the GRE because we have found the GRE to not be a great predictor of success in the MPA program. A better predictor, undergraduate GPA, work experience, undergraduate major, those all do a better job of predicting success in the MPA program. Oops, went too far. So once you've selected individuals and you've placed them in a position and you've allocated work to them, you then move into the third function, which is known as evaluation. You need to evaluate their positions and you need to evaluate their performance. There is a big difference between evaluating a job and evaluating someone's performance in that job. So let's talk about how we evaluate jobs first. So for each position within our organization, we need to know what the requirements are for success in those positions. We need to know what the tasks of those positions are on a daily basis. We need to have all that information so that we can put that position into our position classification system and then know how much to compensate someone who is in that classification level. So our first step in the evaluation function is to conduct a job analysis. A job analysis is where we will look at each individual position within our organization, and we will analyze each individual position in isolation, looking at the tasks that are done on a daily basis, the skills that are required to do those tasks, the amount of supervision that is required, sometimes the financial component. Is there a fiduciary component where these people are managing public funds? We'll look at all the different elements of the job and deconstruct each individual job within our organization so we know what each individual position does. That's a job analysis. Once we have deconstructed and analyzed every single position within our organization, we can then move on to what we call a job evaluation. Job evaluation is where we compare jobs to each other. And we compare those jobs, again, based upon the required skills, the amount of supervision and responsibility for that position, how dangerous the conditions. Is it dangerous working conditions? Is it not dangerous working conditions? Does it require physical effort or only mental effort? So we compare our jobs one to another. And so, example of this would be in a police department. You would do a job analysis for the position of police chief. You do a job analysis for the position of lieutenant, the position of sergeant, the position of patrol officer. You would analyze each of those positions independently, and then the job evaluation, you would then compare them to each other. One very common way to do a job evaluation, and one of the easiest ways, is what's called a point factor evaluation. In a point factor job evaluation, what we will do is we will look at all the skills, responsibility, conditions, all those different elements of each job. We will then weight each one of those elements based upon which elements are most important, which elements are least important, and we'll then give a score for each position on each one of those weighted elements. So a police chief position would probably score very high on supervisory responsibility. Also score very high on budgeting responsibility because the police chief will put together the department's budget. But the police chief may score much lower than on something like threat of physical harm because they have much less of a threat than a patrol officer. A patrol officer's analysis may have found that that patrol officer is in a much more dangerous condition, so scores much higher than the police chief, but much lower on supervisory responsibilities and much lower on budget management and analysis. So in the point vector evaluation, you end up for each of your position with a point amount. So, this position gets this many points, this position gets this many points. And what you can then do is you can then take those resulting points for each of those positions and then array those positions on your position classification system, and then assign compensation based upon where those positions fall in your position classification system. So job evaluation, this comparison of position to position, will then create our job classification system, which will then allow us to assign pay grades. The job analysis and job evaluation also will help create position descriptions or job descriptions that we can then provide to our employees so those employees know what they are doing on a daily basis. There are traditional position descriptions and there are what are called result-oriented descriptions, or RODs. The movement has been away from traditional descriptions and more toward results-oriented descriptions. And the big difference is, in a traditional position description, the description may tell you that 20% of your time is spent answering phones. 40% of your time is spent typing correspondence. 40% of your time may be spent referring clients to the appropriate office. This is what you are doing. In a results-oriented description, we will then tell the person, this is the expectation for how well you will do it. So maybe, again, 20% of your time is spent answering calls. Maybe a result that we are expecting is that all calls are answered by the second ring and all inquiries are routed to the proper extension. That's an expectation. Typing a correspondence, we're not only saying you're typing correspondence, where you may say you have to type 60 words per minute with less than 2 errors per page. Whatever the case is, we have some empirical standards, and we're letting you know what those results, expected results, are in the job description, so going into it. The nice thing about a results-oriented description like that is that once you then go and evaluate the performance of that employee, there are then no surprises. So that employee knows the expectation of their performance level. If they don't achieve that performance level, and then they get a more negative evaluation than they would have hoped, they're more likely to accept that negative performance evaluation because they knew going into it that they had not achieved that performance level. So it really helps you then with this performance evaluation process. So we don't just evaluate the jobs, we have to evaluate the incumbent's performance of that job. Performance evaluation is difficult. It's difficult because supervisors don't like to evaluate employee performance, and employees don't like to have their performance evaluated. Obviously, supervisors don't like to evaluate employee performance because they have this fear of playing God, because with a performance evaluation, the implications of getting a poor evaluation are profound. So if you get a poor evaluation, it may mean that you're not going to be eligible for promotion, may mean that you won't be eligible to remain in the organization. You may eventually end up losing your job. You may have certain serious training deficiencies that have to be rectified. So there are some really profound implications for giving someone a poor performance evaluation. But sometimes leaders are hesitant to do it. No one wants to be the bad guy. Employees are very hesitant to get performance evaluations because of the fear of what we call cognitive dissonance. If you're familiar with the term cognitive dissonance, it means essentially if you hear something you're not expecting to hear. So employees expect they're going to get a glowing performance evaluation, and then they get an average performance evaluation. Obviously, that's going to make them very cautious about getting evaluated again, because they were disappointed once, will they be disappointed again? So leaders and employees don't like to engage in performance evaluation to begin with. The process is then complicated because we oftentimes don't use the right performance evaluation tool to evaluate performance. On the screen, you will see I've listed some tools for performance evaluation that are frequently used in public organizations. The first one is what's called a graphic rating type of evaluation. This is probably the most common type of evaluation that we see. It's, they'll strongly agree, neutral, disagree, strongly disagree. That's a graphic rating type of an evaluation. So the employee is always on time, strongly agree, and so on and so on. Graphic rating is very easy to do because you're just selecting one of those answers, multiple choice answers. So it's very easy to do. It's very easy for employees to consume. The problem is it doesn't provide a lot of formative feedback. So you can see you might have a statement that the employee interacts productively with fellow employees, and you get a neutral, neither agree nor disagree. Well, what does that tell you? As an employee, it doesn't give you any background or any details about how to improve the way in which you're interacting with fellow employees. So there's not a whole lot of formative feedback that comes out of a graphic rating system. There are also a lot of measurement errors that can happen in graphic rating. Sometimes managers want to be nice, and so they do what's called the halo effect. And the halo effect, they'll just go down and circle all the strongly agrees to make their employee look as good as possible. There's also what's known as regression to the mean, and some managers will select the middle category to give people some place to grow. And so all the grades will then regress toward the mean, and the mean will be right in the middle of the ranking. Another error is what's known as a recency error. And the recency error, the manager, typing I'm talking, so the recency error is the manager will base their evaluation on their most recent interaction with that employee. Now, maybe the previous interactions were great with that employee, but the most recent interaction wasn't great, and so the entire evaluation is based on that one recent interaction. So there are problems with graphic rating. There's a forced choice type of tool that can be used for evaluation. So we will give statements, and then supervisors will select the most appropriate statement. So one statement could be the employee is always on time. Another statement could be the employee is late on average 1 day per week, and so on and so on. Bad thing about forced choice is if we don't provide the appropriate statement for the supervisor to select, you're going to have a lot of measurement error. Ranking system where you literally rank the performance of your employees. And so this employee is number 1, this is 2, this is 3, this is 4. Again, it's good for compensation, but it's not very good for providing formative feedback. The essay approach provides a lot of formative feedback, but it's hard to do comparisons between employee performance. And then the one that really is probably superior to the others is what's known as the BARS approach. And BARS stands for a behaviorally anchored rating scale. And a behaviorally anchored rating scale is kind of like what you see on a syllabus when you have a grading rubric. It's essentially a performance rubric where you'll say to get an excellent evaluation, here's the behavior that you would have to exhibit. So for an excellent behavior, the behavior you'd have to exhibit is you were never late during this entire evaluation period. Okay, well, if I was late one day, I know I'm not going to get that excellent rating. So, maybe the very good rating is the next step down where you were late more than once, but we were late at least once, but no more than 5 times in the last performance period. Well, I was late twice, so I know I fall into that category. But you link the behavior directly to the performance rating. This way, the employee is getting that formative feedback along with just their ranking system. And so it provides more information. That's the reason why it's usually considered to be a superior type of performance evaluation. But good managers in the public sector know how to evaluate the performance of their employees. The problem, again, with the public sector is that oftentimes the things we are ranking people or rating people on are much more subjective and qualitative than the types of performance indicators you may have for a private sector employee. Then based upon that evaluation, we then may have to provide some training and development. Again, if there's subpar performance, you can't just discipline and sanction someone for it. You need to provide them with the opportunity for professional development. Once that professional development has been provided, you then at a future point in time will reevaluate the performance of that employee. If the performance is still deficient, You will then provide more training and development opportunities. Then you will reevaluate the person again. You'll probably have to go through this multiple times to create a paper trail of documentation. After 3 or 4 times of evaluating the employee and providing training opportunities, if the evaluation is still subpar, even in a career civil service system, you can still discipline employees and eventually still terminate those employees. The difference, though, is in the career civil service, discipline and termination must be done for cause, must be linked directly to performance, as opposed to how it oftentimes is done in the private sector. So again, I don't want to belabor the functions of the management of human resources too much, because you have an entire standalone core course in human resource management where you will get into this information in a lot more detail. But it's important that we have an understanding of how the management of public human resources differs from the management of private human resources. Because the amount of money that you spend on human resource in your organization will likely be above 85 to 90% of your entire organization's budget. So 85 to 90% at the least will go toward human resources. So it's a huge chunk of the financial resources of the organization. So if you don't do a good job managing your human resources, by definition, you're not doing a good job managing your organization's financial resources either. So again, just kind of foreshadow some of the information that you'll get in 577, but the management of human resources, one major function that public managers engage in public administration. So at this point, are there any initial questions or observations on what we've covered with the management of human resources or the development of public employment through the era of gentlemen, era of spoils, and era of merit? Okay, Rebecca, go ahead.
Thank you. I don't want to delay the class if this was a long explanation, but I'm curious with judicial appointments and those not being elected positions, if that has gone through the same errors or followed a different process.
Yeah, that's a great question. And the fact is, no. You know, the management of human resource and development of employment, when you're looking at judicial appointments, it's a completely different animal, because those, at least at the federal level, you know, those are essentially lifetime types of positions. So there's not that type of evaluation process that federal judges go through as compared to what you might see at the state level. Now, when it comes to state judges, there's much more of an evaluation process, because in a lot of states, those judicial positions are oftentimes elected positions. And so in a lot of states, members of the Supreme Court, the state Supreme Court, will be elected positions. And so that election kind of stands as the performance evaluation. It's just the voters who are doing the evaluation, as opposed to having some type of supervisor doing that evaluation. There is an evaluation process from the American Bar Association, from the ABA, that will evaluate and rate potential appointees to the federal judiciary. And so they can be rated as highly qualified, can be rated as qualified, they can be rated as not qualified. And in the past, that qualification, if you weren't at least qualified, chances are you would not make it through the nomination and confirmation process to be a member of the federal judiciary. There have been several judicial appointments over the past several years where people have been not rated as not qualified by the American Bar Association and have still made it through the nomination and confirmation process. And so it'll be interesting to see in the future, in terms of judicial performance, how those folks who are rated not qualified by the ABA perform with cases in the future, because it's kind of unusual for us to see not qualified candidates actually make it through that confirmation process. So it's kind of a shift in the way in which we've been appointing people to the federal judiciary. But it is very much of a different animal in the judicial branch as compared to the executive branch. That's an excellent question. Okay, then at this point, let's go ahead and take a break. We're about halfway through our information. So the management of financial resources will probably go a little bit quicker than the management of human resources, but let's take about a 10-minute break. Come on back at 5:30 and we'll shift gears into the management of financial resources. We'll talk about different types of budgets. We'll talk about how you manage budgets. We'll talk about different forms of taxation, and then wrap it up with a discussion of the future of the management of financial resources. And then that will wrap up all of our information for the course. So take about 10 minutes, come back at 5:30 for management of financial resources. All right, welcome back. Let's do our last topic for the course, which is the management of financial resources. And again, this just kind of hit that tip of the iceberg that you'll get the rest of this information in PPA 525, the public budgeting and finance. But at least when you get to 555, you'll be somewhat familiar with different types of budgets and some of the information that will help you be successful once you get to 555. So obviously, as we've said, again, we're underscoring these differences between public and private sector. And we know in the public sector, we are managing public taxpayer funds. So managing public taxpayer funds means that there's heightened transparency requirements, there's heightened accountability requirements, as compared to if you were in a corporation, just managing funds that belong to private sector individuals, managing funds under the auspices of a board of directors, as compared to managing public taxpayer dollars. So it's important to note that the state and local level, as we manage these public taxpayer dollars, we typically do it in two different types of budgets. At the state and local level, we tend to use both what we call operating as well as capital budgets. And sometimes this can be confusing for some voters. And so sometimes people will see, for instance, on campus, there'll be a major construction project going on campus during a time of extreme economic stress. And people say, oh, why is the money being spent on this new building as opposed to being spent to try and lower costs for students? And the answer is because there are two different pots of money. One pot of money is for the operating expenses or expenditures of that government organization. So the operating budget will be for the day-to-day operations of that entity. So you'll pay your salary and your benefits and your supplies and your maintenance, and that will oftentimes come out of your operating budget. Then you have a separate budget known as the capital budget. And the capital budget is then used for these capital projects, these long lifespan, high price tag, non-recurring types of projects, such as constructing a city hall or constructing a recreation center. Those are very expensive projects. They're projects that are going to be around for a while, and those tend to get funded in a separate capital budget. So the question then is, why do state and local governments tend to separate money in an operating budget and a capital budget? And the reason for that is that in the vast majority of states, the requirement is that you must balance your budget. So your revenues must equal your expenditures. If you had, say, a $100 million capital project, so you're constructing a new building, it's going to cost $100 million. If you put that into your operating budget, it would become impossible for you to balance your revenues and expenditures. You would, by definition, end up running a deficit, which then runs afoul of state constitution and state law. So we take these big projects and we put them into a separate capital budget. And again, we do that at the state and the local level. The federal government doesn't do that. The federal government uses a unified budget where it puts everything in the budget together. It can do that because the size and scope of the federal budget is so immense that a $100 million capital project is literally like a drop in the bucket. And you don't really see it. It's not going to blow a hole in an operating budget like it would for a local city. So we maintain operating budgets for the day-to-day operations of the government, and then capital budgets to fund these long lifespan, high price tag, non-recurring types of capital projects. So how do we go through the process of budgeting in the public sector? And regardless of whether we're talking about the federal level, the state level, or the local level, we essentially go through 4 different phases in the budgeting process. The first phase is preparation. And when you get into the 555 class, you will go through these 4 different phases at the federal level and then talk about how they relate to the 4 phases here in the state of California. It's kind of beyond the scope of what we do here in 500 to get into, but I do think it's important that we understand that there are these 4 phases. So the first phase, the preparation phase. This is usually where we are doing our revenue forecasts and our expenditure estimates to answer the question, how much money will we be able to generate next year in revenue, and how much money will it cost us to continue maintaining the same level of services next year that we provided this year? So revenue forecasts and expenditure estimates. At the federal level, this is done by the Office of Management and Budget for the President and by the Congressional Budget Office for the Congress. Here in the state of California, the Department of Finance does it for the governor, and the Legislative Analyst Office does it primarily for the state legislature. So this is where we're putting our budgets together, and we're estimating and forecasting the amount of revenue and expenditures we will have and need. At the federal level, once we move to the first week of February, so the president has already given their State of the Union address, and then we move into the month of February, the president's budget then goes to the Congress. And whenever the president's budget goes to Congress, we shift from preparation into formulation. So the formulation phase is the legislative consideration of the budget. So at the federal level, that's going to last from the beginning of February until September 30th. Here in the state of California, that's going to last from about mid-January until June 15th, where the state legislature considers the governor's budget. During formulation is when the legislature will hold hearings, will mark up appropriation bills. It's important to know at the federal level in formulation, there are 2 different processes going on at the same time. There's one process for discretionary spending, and there's one process for mandatory spending. Discretionary spending is spending that Congress has direct control over. So if Congress can decide we want to spend less on program A and more on program B, it can do that directly. It has the discretion to do it. The second type of spending is mandatory spending. Mandatory spending is spending that Congress does not have direct control over. So you think about entitlement programs, you think about things like Social Security. Those types of programs are eligibility-based programs. So if you meet the eligibility requirements to get benefits from those programs, you are legally entitled to those benefits. Since you're legally entitled to those benefits, Congress cannot reduce your benefits unless it changes the eligibility requirements. So it has to do kind of in an indirect way, it has to go back and change the eligibility requirements in order to spend less on that type of a program. So with Social Security, it would have to go back and increase the retirement age, and that increase in retirement age would then mean less people would then be eligible for Social Security funds, and therefore you would end up spending less on Social Security. Things like interest on the debt is also considered mandatory spending. Congress has borrowed the money. Congress now has to make principal and interest payments on that money that it has borrowed. So for discretionary spending, that goes through what we call the appropriations process. And so Congress will pass out 12 separate appropriation bills, one bill for each area of spending. So there'll be an education appropriations bill, health and human services appropriations bill, defense appropriations bill. So there'll be 12 different appropriation bills for discretionary spending. Mandatory spending will be going through what we call an authorization process. So we'll go through authorization committees to see if we need to change any eligibility requirements. So you gotta have this duality that goes on the budgeting process at the federal level through formulation. But if everything goes well the way which it's supposed to go at the federal level, by September 30th, Congress will have passed out 12 separate appropriation bills. Those appropriation bills then go to the president for their signature before the beginning of the new fiscal year. The federal fiscal year runs from October 1st until September 30th. So if everything goes well, all of those appropriation bills will be signed by the president no later than October 1st, the first day of the next federal fiscal year. Here in California, formulation runs until June 15th. And the state legislature must pass the budget bill no later than June 15th to be signed by the governor for the beginning of the new state fiscal year, which occurs on July 1st. So we operate under a different fiscal year than the federal government, which can kind of be confusing if you're receiving a lot of federal grants and aid. Federal government has reporting requirements based upon its fiscal year from October 1st to September 30th. State of California is on a different fiscal year, July 1st until June 30th. But if everything goes well and the chief executive signs the budget or the appropriation bills at the federal level at the end of formulation, then once the new fiscal year begins, October 1st for the federal government, July 1st for the state of California, you then shift into the execution phase of budgeting. Execution is when we spend the money. So once the fiscal year starts, we start spending the money, we are then in execution. So we spend the money throughout the fiscal year, and then when the fiscal year ends and the new fiscal year begins, we then move into evaluation, where we go back and we audit how we spent the money. This is where we do our legal and financial audit, our management and performance-based audits to see how we spent the money and how well we spent the money. Once you're doing those audits, and once the fiscal year is ended, you're then moved into the fourth phase known as the evaluation phase, where you're doing your auditing. What makes this process somewhat complicated? There are a lot of things, but one thing that makes it complicated is that we will be in different phases of the budgeting process for different fiscal years. So when we are in the execution phase for the current fiscal year and we're spending the money, we are in the formulation phase for the next fiscal year. And we're in the preparation phase for 2 fiscal years from now. And we're in the evaluation phase for the last fiscal year. And so we'll have 4 different fiscal years all overlapping on top of one another, just in different phases of the budgeting process. But this 4-stage budgeting process, preparation, formulation, execution, evaluation, that's true for the federal level. It's also true for the vast majority of states as well. As you get to your 535 class, you will talk about the specifics of what goes on in each one of those 4 phases of the budgeting process. But for our purposes right now, at this point tonight, just knowing those 4 phases exist is really where we are at here in 500. How you put a budget together can differ depending upon the budget format you use. So budgets look different from each other. So if you look at one city's budget, it may look a lot different than another city's budget, which may look a lot different than another city's budget, because there are different budget formats that can be used by cities. The budget format that is used will be dependent upon what you're using the budget for and the purpose that you are using that budget for. Let me just briefly introduce you to a theorist by the name of Alan Schick. And I'll put this in text chat, Alan Schick. And Schick makes the argument that there are 3 primary functions or purposes of a budget document. So there are 3 purposes or 3 functions we can use a budget document for. The first purpose, according to Schick, is the purpose of control. So we want to control how much money we're spending, and we want to control what we are spending that money on. Again, it's public taxpayer money. We know there's a finite supply of that public taxpayer money, so we want to make sure we are spending it appropriately. We're spending as little of it as we can, and we're spending it on the things that society would like us to spend that money on. That's all about control. That's the first function or purpose. The second function or purpose you can use a budget document for is for management. To use the budget document to help you manage the operations of your organization. And then the third purpose you can use a budget document for, according to Schick, is planning. You can use your budget document to help you plan the operations of your organization. Now, those 3 purposes, control, management, and planning. When you're using your budget document for control, the decision-making model that you are tending to use will be incrementalism. So our decisions will be relatively incremental, small changes from one year to the next. because a budget that's oriented around control will probably not give us the information we need to manage the operations of our organization or to plan the operations of our organization. We'll just get the information we need to control how much money we're spending and what we are spending that money on. So we are very incremental in our decision making. When we are doing our budgeting for the purpose of control, that's when we tend to use this first budget format known as a line item budget. In a line item budget, and I have some examples of these up on our beach board site you can go and take a look at. We're not going to go through them all tonight because, again, this is information you'll cover in 555. But a line item budget, if you've done any budgeting before, it's a very simple budget format whereby you will list everything you're spending your money on and then how much is being spent on each one of those line items. Hence the reason why it's called a line item budget. It tends to foster incremental decision making because you don't get a whole lot of information. All you know is how much money you spent last year and what you spent that money on. And then you'll base this year's budget on what you did last year. You don't have performance indicators, you don't have management indicators, just how much did we spend last year and what we spent the money on. We'll make a small marginal tweak to that, usually increase by maybe 2 or 3% to keep up with the cost of living, and then that will become this year's budget. A line item budget, there's a component of a line item budget in every single budget you're going to look at, regardless of the city, regardless of the county. Every budget you see will have some type of a line item component to it. So it's by far the most common. It's by far the easiest to use. The problem with line item, obviously, as we said before, is you're not getting a lot of information. You don't get the information you need to manage the performance of your organization. If you want to use your budget document to manage the performance of your organization, obviously you're going to move into a performance type of budget. In a performance type of budget, we start using more of a rational type of decision-making model. So we have more rationality that's involved, more rational, comprehensive decision-making. So we'll start building in performance indicators. So the number of people we're serving by funding this program. If it's a program geared toward helping people who are homeless, maybe the number of people who are sheltered on average per night, perhaps the number of meals on average that are served per day, perhaps the number of hours devoted to job training types of programs. We actually know what activities we're engaging in and how well we are engaging those activities. And so if we are providing job training and here's the number of hours, and we're providing more hours of job training than last year, and those people are actually finding jobs, we're performing well. We're spending that money well. And so that's kind of a performance indicator that we get in what we call a performance-based type of a budget. Again, it's a movement toward rationality because now we're looking at some performance indicators of how well we are performing as an organization. If we want to use the budget for more of a planning type of tool, then we're going to be more likely to use something like a program-based budget. And the big difference here is with a program-based budget. A program-based budget is organized around programs rather than units and departments. So when you have a line item budget or a performance-based budget, those budgets are going to be organized around maybe the police department and the fire department and so on and so on. Each department will have its own budget. In a program-based budget, rather than providing the budget for each individual department, we will group activities together that fund the same program. So you may have a program, protection of persons and property. That protection of persons and property program may be carried out through activities that are funded through the police department. You may have the fire department that contributes to that. You may have some emergency preparedness department that will contribute to it as well. You don't put up your artificial boundaries between your departments in your budget, but rather you budget everything that contributes to protection of persons and property together, irrespective of which department is actually engaging in those activities. As you can see with this program-based budgeting, it helps you plan because it helps to allow you to see how all these different activities and all these different personnel are working together to achieve the same programmatic goal. It is much more of a movement toward rationality, even more rational than what we had with a performance-based budget. But it can allow you to plan the operations of your organization. Fourth type of budget format is what's known as zero-based budgeting. Very few local governments do this because it's a very resource-intensive, very expensive type of approach. But essentially in zero-based budgeting, you go back and you re-justify what you are spending your money on. So here's a program. These are the consequences of funding this program. Here's what will happen if we fund the program at a higher level. Here's what will happen if we fund the program at a lower level. So let's say, for instance, one alternative is to fund the program at 110%. So 10% more than we funded it at last year. What are the consequences? Well, we may be able to serve 100 additional people or serve 100 additional meals compared to what we were able to serve last year with this additional 10%. But what if we funded it at 90% of what we funded it last year? So a 10% reduction. Well, we may be able to serve 100 fewer citizens and 100 fewer meals. But those are the consequences of those different funding levels. A zero-based budgeting approach is a very rational approach because it's a bottom-up approach in that we go to the lowest level of organization and let those individuals and those units put together all these what we call decision packages. And so in zero-based budgeting, you create what are called decision packages. And each decision package will present a scenario of what will happen, what are the consequences of all these different funding approaches. You then rank and prioritize all those different decision packages, send them up the organizational chart, they get re-ranked and reprioritized, and then the top ranked, top prioritized programs then become part of your organization's budget. But everyone in the organization essentially has the opportunity to participate in the construction of that organization's budget. So clearly, it's a very resource and time-intensive type of endeavor to engage in. That's why most local governments do not use it. I know Seal Beach uses a zero-based budgeting process, and they're one of the only cities in Southern California to do that. So when you get to your 555 class, if you have to select a city budget and you want to do zero-based budgeting, Seal Beach would be a city that you would want to select as your example. So line item performance program and zero-based budgeting are the four main types of budget formats you'll cover in your 555 class. Again, they are used for different purposes. Line item, the very simple budget used if you want to use your document as control. Performance, if you want to use it to help manage your organization. Program and zero-based budgets, if you want to use your budget document to help plan the operations of your organizations. But in order to put our budgets together, and in order to even have a budget document to begin with, we need to have some revenue that we are generating. So we need to have some sources of revenue that we can generate. So the question then becomes, where will our revenue come from? For most governments, revenue comes from taxation. That's why we've been saying the heightened accountability standards are because we're dealing with public taxpayer money. So the public has a right to know how this money is being spent. The three primary categories of tax-based revenue sources in public budgeting: property income and consumption or sales taxes. Property taxes, as you are familiar, are taxes that are placed upon the assessed valuation of a parcel of property. The assessed valuation of a parcel of property is the value of that property that is subject to taxation. So if your assessed value of your property is $500,000, the tax rate gets applied to that $500,000 amount, which will then give you your property tax liability. Here in California, local governments are limited in their ability to generate property tax revenue because of Proposition 13. And I'm sure if you're a homeowner, you're very familiar with Proposition 13. Proposition 13 limits the overall property tax rate that local governments can charge typically Proposition 13 lowers that rate to 1%. Now, your property tax rate limit may be a little bit higher. There are some local add-ons that may get you up to 1.2 or 1.25%. If you live in an area with Melrose taxes, then it's going to be much higher than that. Your rate could go upwards of 2.5% to 3%, depending upon the assessment district that you live in. But Proposition 13 placed a 1% limitation on property tax rates. A 1% limitation essentially is $1 per $100 of the assessed value of a piece of property. It's a percentage, so it's 1 per 100. Proposition 13 also limited the rate at which your assessed valuation can increase on an annual basis to 2%. So unless the property changes hands, or unless the property has had some major improvements and renovations, the value of that property for the purposes of property taxation can only increase by a maximum of 2% per year. If you're limiting the tax rate to 1%, and you're limiting the increase in assessed valuation to 2%, you combine those two things together, and in Proposition 13, they will then limit the overall amount of property tax revenue that a local government can generate. So local governments in California are very much limited in how much property tax revenue they can generate. The nice thing about the property tax is that it's a very stable form of revenue for local governments. Local governments can predict very easily how much money they're going to generate from property tax revenue. The downside of the property tax is it tends to be a relatively unfair and what we call regressive form of taxation. We oftentimes compare taxes based upon how regressive or progressive they are. A regressive type of tax will have a more adverse impact on lower income individuals than upper income individuals. So if people who are making less than $30,000 a year are paying 30% of their income in taxation, and people who are making more than $1 million a year are paying 10% in taxation, that's a regressive form of tax because lower income individuals are paying more of their income in taxation than upper income individuals. So that would be regressive. The opposite of regressive is a progressive tax, and it's just you invert that. So people in upper income groups pay a higher percentage than people in lower income groups. We typically strive for a progressive type of tax. However, the property tax can be regressive because there is a disconnect between the value of your property and perhaps your annual income. You're being taxed based upon the value of your property, irrespective of how much money you're making per year. You're probably not going to pay your property taxes by refinancing or selling your property. You're probably going to pay your property taxes out of the income you're generating each year. So if you're making $10,000 a year and you have a $500,000 parcel of property, that property tax rate is going to be pretty regressive for you. There are also some idiosyncrasies in Proposition 13 that you'll cover when you get to your public budgeting course, but things such as what we call the welcome stranger approach. That here in California with Proposition 13, property values are reassessed for taxation purposes when that property changes hands. So whenever that property is sold, then the assessed value is reset at that sales price. And so if a piece of property that was owned for 30 years that was purchased for $50,000 is then sold to someone else for $1 million, the assessed value of the property will then be that $1 million sales price. And the person who's buying that $1 million home will have a much higher sales tax liability than the person who bought that home at the lower value back 30 years ago. So it's that welcome stranger approach. That's kind of an interesting quirk to Proposition 13 that makes our property tax structure a lot different than what we see in many other states. Property tax is a primary domain for local governments, and this is what local governments are going to use primarily as their general form of taxation. Before Proposition 13, local governments here in California were overwhelmingly reliant upon the property tax for revenue. After Proposition 13, they have moved to other revenue sources because of the limitations imposed on them by Proposition 13. Second type of tax source that we oftentimes see used is the income tax. Income taxes are the domain of the federal government, and the federal government raises the vast majority of its money from the federal income tax. Most states will use an income tax as well, not all states, but most states will. And that state income tax generates a pretty fair amount of revenue for that state government. Income taxes are usually seen as being more progressive than the property tax. And the reason for that is because of our graduated marginal tax bracket system. So the way in which the federal income tax is designed, similar to how it's designed here in the state of California, is it's predicated upon a graduated marginal tax bracket system, meaning that as your income goes up, the percentage you owe in income taxes goes up as well. So if you're in the lowest income category, you may end up paying no income taxes at all. If you're in the highest income category, you may pay up to 39% of your income in taxation. So again, that kind of makes it seem like a more progressive type of tax. However, it's important to note that that's what makes it graduated. The marginal nature of a graduated marginal tax bracket system is also important, in that those tax brackets are what we call marginal tax brackets. So up to about $10,000, you will pay at the lowest tax rate. Then for every dollar you earn above $10,000 up to $41,000, you will then pay at the next highest tax percentage. Then every dollar above $41,000 under like $85,000 will be paid at the next higher tax rate. And so your entire income, if you're at the highest tax bracket, you're at the 39% tax bracket for federal income taxes, your entire income will not be taxed at 39%. Only every dollar over, I forget what the amount is, but it's over like $1,100,000. Every dollar above that will then be taxed at the 39% level. Every dollar below that will be taxed at a lower percentage. That's what makes those tax brackets marginal in nature. And again, that's what makes the income tax seem a little bit more progressive than a property tax, because we are taking into account the income that you'll use to pay that tax and determining what your tax liability will be. Again, federal government very reliant upon the income tax, state governments reliant upon income taxes as well. In a lot of states, not California, but in a lot of states, local governments also have access to income tax revenue. And in some states, certain local governments like school districts also have access to the income tax. The property tax and the income tax are both what we refer to as ability to pay taxes. So we base your tax you owe on your ability to pay that tax. So with the property tax, your ability to pay is measured by the value of your home. With an income tax, your ability to pay is measured by your adjusted gross income. Sales consumption-based taxes are based upon a benefits received principle, which means that you will pay taxes based on the amount of benefit that you get from consuming some type of a good or service. You go out there, you purchase a good or service, you consume that good or service, you derive a benefit from that consumption, the tax is then made to be attached to that benefit. If you don't purchase that good and you don't consume it, you're not deriving any benefit, so you pay no taxes. There are two basic categories of sales-based taxes. There are general sales taxes, and there are what we call selective excise taxes. In a general sales tax, the general sales tax rate applies to almost all commodities that are transacted within a jurisdiction. It doesn't matter what you are buying, you're paying the same tax rate regardless of what you're buying. It's a general sales tax. General sales taxes can be very regressive because they tend to have more of an impact on lower income people than higher income people. Because lower income people will have less disposable income left over after purchasing the staples of life like food and clothing and shelter than their upper income counterparts. So what you need to do to make the general sales tax a little bit fairer and a little bit more progressive would be to include what we call commodity-based exemptions. So what you will do is you will exempt things such as food, You'll exempt things such as pharmaceutical medication. In some states, you'll exempt up to $500 in clothing. By having those commodity-based exemptions, exempting the staples of life, you can make that sales tax a little bit more fair. Then with selective excise sales taxes, we are applying sales taxes differentially depending upon the type of good that is being consumed. So you could have what referred to as a luxury tax. So you might have a tax on yachts, thinking that people who purchase yachts are from upper income levels, which is probably true. But if you raise the luxury tax too high and it becomes cost prohibitive, those upper income individuals will stop purchasing yachts, which means that shipyards will stop building yachts. If shipyards stop building yachts, then you put a lot of those shipyard workers, those shipbuilders, out of work, and you're actually having an impact where you don't want to have that impact on lower income workers. Another type of consumption-based tax is what we call a sumptuary or a sin tax. In a sumptuary or sin tax, we put taxes on alcohol, on tobacco products. The idea being it will allow us to generate revenue while reducing the demand for some quote unquote socially undesirable type of behavior. So we want people to quit consuming tobacco, so we'll place a tax on tobacco products to increase the price so that people will not want to pay that price anymore. They'll stop consuming those cigarette and those tobacco products. Problem there is if we really are raising the price high enough so that we're going to reduce consumption, we're probably not going to generate a lot of money because if people aren't purchasing it, you're not generating a whole lot of sales tax revenue. And that's kind of the hypocritical nature sometimes of a sumptuary or a sin tax. People tend to like sumptuary taxes because it allows them to shift the burden onto someone else. And so if I don't drink alcohol or if I don't consume tobacco products, I don't have to pay the tax. So I can shift the burden of taxation onto someone who does consume alcohol or someone who does consume tobacco products. Another type, and then we'll leave it at this, but another type of selective excise tax is what we call a benefit-based excise tax. So that would be something like the gas tax. We know there's a federal tax on gasoline per gallon. We know there's a state tax on gasoline per gallon. Those federal and state gas taxes are then captured, that revenue, and that revenue then goes into a highway trust fund to help repair and rebuild our roads and our highways. If you're purchasing gas, you're putting in your car, the benefit you get is being able to drive that car on the roads, which will cause damage to the roads. So therefore, the gas tax proceeds will help pay for some of that damage. Sales taxes are primarily the domain of state governments and local governments. The federal government does not currently have a sales tax. Vast majority of state governments have sales taxes, and vast majority of local governments get a local option sales tax as well, including here in the state of California. With the advent of Proposition 13, we said that we saw cities move away from reliance upon property taxes and move more to a reliance on non-tax sources of revenue. So non-tax sources of revenue are usually things such as user charges and user fees. A user charge is money that is derived from the consumption of some type of a service. So for instance, utilities. So you utilize utilities, you pay a charge based upon the amount of the utility that you have consumed. You are deriving a benefit from consuming some type of a service. And that's what's considered to be a user charge. With a user fee, there's usually no consumption of service that is being done. Usually with a user fee, those fees are connected to the issuance of licenses. So if you want to hunt in the state, you have to get a hunting license. You want to fish, you have to get a fishing license. You want to drive, you have to get a driver's license. You want to put your car on the road, you have to get a registration. You have to pay a fee for all those different types of things. Licensing is important for governments because when governments issue licenses, they can then control who engages in a certain type of behavior and how they will engage in that behavior. The government then gets control over who engages in the behavior and how they engage in the behavior. So that's an important thing for governments to do. You want to open a franchise, McDonald's or something, or Burger King, you have to get a franchise license, you have to pay a franchise fee. But so what? The so what here is that we have seen the share of local revenue that's coming from non-tax sources like user charges and user fees greatly increase. And we've seen the amount of tax-based revenue decrease. And that's for a typical city here in the state of California. That is important because there is a limitation on the number of programs that you can fund with things like user charges. If it's a redistributive program, so if it's a program that redistributes wealth from one segment of society to another, it's going to be hard for you to utilize a user charge because those people who you're giving the benefits to, that you're redistributing wealth toward, are having their wealth redistribute toward them because they don't have it to begin with. So if you charge them for this redistribution of wealth, you're defeating the purpose of a redistributive program. But we have seen cities move more and more toward user charges and user fees. Unfortunately, we have seen governments also move toward the issuance of a lot of debt and running deficits. As you will see when you get to your public budgeting course, there is a difference between a deficit and what we consider to be debt. A deficit is an imbalance in revenue and expenditures within one given fiscal year. So in one fiscal year, if our expenditures exceed our revenues, we are running what we call a deficit. Now, as I said, most state and local governments are precluded from running a deficit. The federal government is not. The federal government can run a deficit whenever it wants. We've seen the federal government run deficits every single year since 1969, with the exception of 2 years. And it seems every year that deficit gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Deficits are usually not a good sign for fiscal health, in that if you can't balance your books and you have more expenditures than you have in revenues, obviously that's a very bad sign for your fiscal solvency. So a deficit is one given fiscal year imbalance between revenues and expenditures. Debt is long-term. Not all debt is bad. We issue debt, we borrow money in order to build buildings and to construct important capital projects. So if you are borrowing money and you have the wherewithal to repay that money, and you're using the proceeds of that money that you are borrowing in order to improve your physical plant, to improve your capital plant, that's a good use of debt. And that does not necessarily always signal poor fiscal solvency. So deficits are usually an indicator of poor fiscal solvency. Debts usually are not. Or sometimes can, but oftentimes are not. Now, if you run deficits every single year, the accumulation of those annual deficits will obviously add up to a higher and higher amount of long-term debt. So your deficits accumulate into debt. So it depends on where the debt's coming from, what the debt is being used for. In terms of debt, there's long-term and short-term debts. At the local level, long-term debt's referred to as bonds. Short-term debt, which is debt that matures in less than 1 year, usually referred to as notes. And when you get to your 525 class, you'll talk about how to manage debt. You'll talk about different strategies you can use to spend less money on managing debt. We'll talk about different debt mechanisms like general obligation and double barrel and revenue bonds. You get all those types of specifics once you get to 555. But it is important to note that there is this structural difference between deficits and debt. Deficits are imbalance in one given fiscal year. Debts are much more long-term in nature and are not always bad, depending upon what those debts are being used for. One thing that we do know is that budgeting in the public sector is hard. And it's hard because of all the different actors who are involved in the budgeting process. There are a lot more actors involved in public budgeting than in private sector budgeting. And all those actors involved in the public budgeting process all have much different vested interests and much different stakes in the game than what you might see in the private sector. Because of this, the amount of people, the amount of actors involved in budgeting, the budgeting process, especially at the federal level, has really been out of control for decades now. We've always struggled to get our budgets done on time. We've always struggled to bring our budgets in on budget by avoiding deficits and having our revenues at least equal our expenditures. We've always had those types of problems in the budgeting process at the federal level. In the state of California, we tend to fare a lot better in that we kind of have one-party government in the state legislature. Whether that's good or bad, I will leave up to you. But we have Democratic control of 2/3 majority in the state assembly, 2/3 majority in the state Senate, and a Democratic governor. When you add all of that up, it means that you don't really run into a lot of trouble getting the budget done on time, and you end up having a lot of agreement among those actors on what's included in the budget and how much money we're spending, what we're spending that money on. But at the federal level, we know that we have a lot of gridlock. The budgeting process has become very partisan and very conflictual. So we've attempted to try and reform the federal budgeting process a multitude of times over the past several decades. I just kind of want to give you a flavor of some of the things we've done to try and change the federal budgeting process and why we have found it necessary to try and make these changes. So in the 1970s, we became very concerned because by 1974, we had run 5 consecutive years of a federal budget deficit, meaning that our expenditures exceeded our revenues in each of those 5 years. That was a cause for panic in Congress in 1974. So in 1974, we get the passage of this thing called the Budget and Impoundment Control Act. The Budget and Impoundment Control Act changed the process of budgeting at the federal level. It created House and Senate budget committees. So it created a budget committee in the House and a budget committee in the Senate. And it said whenever the president sent their budget over to Congress to start the formulation phase, that president's budget would go to the House Budget Committee and to the Senate Budget Committee. The House and Senate Budget Committee would then pass resolutions, and those resolutions would then set a maximum amount of spending in each of our programmatic areas to try and impose some fiscal discipline on Congress in terms of the amount of money that it was spending. It tried to make Congress a co-equal in the budgeting process with the president. It created this thing called the Congressional Budget Office. It limited the president's ability to impound money, to refuse to spend money in appropriation bills. So it was meant to try and get budgets done on time. It was meant to try and get budgets done by balancing revenues and expenditures. And it was also meant to make Congress a co-equal player in the budgeting process with the president. It failed on all 3 of those counts. After it was passed in 1974, we still weren't getting budgets done on time. After it was passed, we were still running budget deficits, and those deficits kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And the president continued to have more control of the budgeting process than Congress. What we basically found out with the Budget and Impoundment Control Act is we can't solve our budgeting problems by focusing on the process alone. We need to focus on other things in addition to changing the process. Just changing the process will not get the job done. So you fast forward into the 1980s. In the 1980s, we have then run 16 consecutive years of federal budget deficits. And every year in the Reagan administration, at least, those budget deficits got bigger and bigger and bigger with each passing year. So instead of trying to control the process necessarily, Congress decides, let's try and control deficits. And so deficits become the bad guy in the 1980s. So this bill called Graham-Rudman-Hollings, and then its follow-up successor, Graham-Rudman-Hollings 2, a couple of years later, what Congress tried to do is it set up maximum deficit targets. And so it seems kind of like a realistic type of expectation that if we set up a maximum deficit target each year, and in each year, the maximum allowable deficit target will then decrease. So, it'll be X million dollars this year, and then maybe $10 million less the next year, and then $30 million less the next year, and so on and so on. If we continue to hit those maximum deficit targets, eventually, in like 20 years or so, we'll then no longer have deficits. We will have reduced and eliminated the deficit by imposing these limitations upon the amount of deficit we are willing to tolerate in any one given fiscal year. Obviously, since we ran deficits all the way through into the late 1990s and then started writing them again in 2001, it didn't work. And it didn't work because Congress didn't have the political willpower to stick by its deficit targets. So every year, if we were exceeding a deficit target, Congress would just readjust those targets upward, and then the whole timetable would shift. So instead of seeing our deficit targets going down, we actually end up seeing the deficit going up. So it was a failure because we focused on deficits and we didn't have the political willpower to make the difficult spending and tax raising decisions in order to try and avoid those deficits. So then moving to the 1990s. In 1990, we get another reform called the Budget Enforcement Act. This reform, instead of focusing on the process or focusing on deficits, the Budget Enforcement Act focused on spending levels. And it said, we can get control of the process, we can get control of deficits by limiting the amount of money that we are spending. Not exactly a novel idea, but it was a novel idea for Congress. That if you spend less money, you're better able to have your revenues match your expenditures. So the Budget Enforcement Act, what they did is they did two things. They created three categories of spending. Those three categories were defense spending, domestic spending, and international spending. They then created firewalls between each one of those categories, meaning that if you wanted to spend more on a domestic program, you couldn't rob from defense or international programs to pay for more domestic programs. If you wanted to increase spending on a domestic program, you either had to find a revenue source or you had to reduce spending on another domestic program within that same domestic category. It also required that we were going to pay for everything as we go, a process known as pay-go. You pay for it as you go. So again, if you want to increase spending on one program or you want to create a new program, you're going to have to pay for it. So you're going to have to say, we're going to pay for this new program with this new tax increase. We're going to pay for this new program by decreasing another program within the same spending area. But you had to pay for your expenditures as you go. Again, to impose some fiscal discipline on the process. Pay-go in one form or another is still around with us today. These three spending categories and the firewalls between them are still around with us today. By 1999, we had gotten to the point where we had reduced deficits to the level of where we had actually balanced the budget. And for two fiscal years in 99 and 2000, we were actually in the world of surplus spending, where we had more revenue than we had in expenditures. Did the Budget Enforcement Act help contribute to that? I think yes, it was a part of it. But another part of the reason why we were able to get away from deficits and get into surplus spending was a very quickly growing economy. This 1990s, we were talking about the dot-com boom, and Silicon Valley was becoming really overvalued. And so we had all these internet companies starting up. We had all these remote transactions going on online, brought in a lot of additional federal income tax revenue. That federal income tax revenue, combined with some of those spending reductions we got from the Budget Enforcement Act, then combined those two together, and you ended up going into surplus spending in 1999 and the year 2000. September 11th happened, and when September 11th happened, that then pushed us back into deficit spending. War in Iraq, war in Afghanistan cost a lot of money, and we were back into deficit spending, and we have been in deficit spending ever since 2001. Well, so what? So what's the moral of the story? The moral of the story is that we were unable to control the federal budgeting process when we only looked at the process and we only looked at deficits. We didn't really become successful until we really had the political willpower to actually impose some of these limitations on spending and couple that with some pretty significant increases in revenue. It's not rocket science. If you want to avoid a deficit, you need more revenue and or fewer expenditures. And that's what we got in 1999 and in 2000. So where are we at then today? Where we're at today is that we are still in deficit spending. We have made some progress over the past couple of years of trying to reduce the size of that deficit, but things come along like COVID, a pandemic, things come along like a housing market collapse. Those types of things will very easily, a terrorist attack, those things will very easily push us back to higher and higher deficits. It's a very long haul, it's a very gradual process, and a lot of work to get away from deficit spending. Here in the state of California, things are looking much better. And if you go and you look at the governor's budget, the May revised, and then the final budget passed by the state legislature this year, you will see that we have a lot more revenue than we anticipated having. We thought coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic that we would see a big reduction in state revenue. Instead, what we have seen is we've seen an increase, whereby we're raising more revenue than we thought we were able to raise, than we ever thought possible. That has allowed the state of California to fund things like education and higher education and workforce training and development programs at much higher levels than they have been ever funded at before. And it's also allowed the state of California to designate a lot of that money to go into an emergency rainy day fund, assuming that these good fiscal times in the state of California may not always continue. But we kind of have this interesting duality where we see financial struggles at the federal level, but we see the state of California actually doing very well financially. So the better the state of California does, the better it is obviously for state and local agencies in California, for the public sector in California. But whenever you have a looming recession at the federal level, that could then obviously have a very negative impact on California, and you could then spiral back into the economic types of troubles that we saw back in 2006, 2007, and 2008. But again, it's important that we do all of our budgeting with a lot of transparency. And so when you get into the budgeting course, you'll then also talk about things like fund-based accounting, double entry accounting, accrual versus cash accounting, and you'll get into a lot of the specifics of how we control the money that we are spending to try and make sure that we are doing the most effective and efficient way of spending public taxpayer dollars as we possibly can. Again, how we manage our human resources, how we manage our financial resources takes up a lot of time of public administrators and will really dictate the effectiveness of our public organizations. And how the management of these functions gets done in the public sector, far different from how they get done over in the private sector. So that wraps up our discussion of managing financial resources. Again, just the tip of the iceberg to get you ready when you get to your PPA 555 course. Do remember, before you can register for PPA 555, you have to get a permit to register for that course. And you can only get a permit to register for that course if you have completed either an undergraduate microeconomics course or you have completed PPA 518 microeconomics for public administrators. And those are the two tickets to then get a permit to be able to get into and take PPA 555. And at 6:30, so that kind of wraps up all of our information for the course. We've kind of brought it in on time, so we've landed the plane on time, which is a good thing. Any questions on the management of human resources or the management of financial resources? Again, what I hope we have done in this course is given you a good introduction to the public sector and what the world of public management is. And so you kind of have a good idea of the differences between public and private sectors. You also have a very good idea of what the study of public administration is all about. And you've also been given an introduction into all the core areas of the MPA curriculum that you will run into as you progress through the program. I hope the course has been useful for you. Again, the course information should stay up and available until about the beginning of November. I do look forward to reading your final Beach Board essay, and I also look forward to reading your final assessments. Beach Board essay due by midnight next Tuesday, final assessment due by midnight next Wednesday. We'll get all the grading then wrapped up and hopefully have your grades up and ready to go by October 14th so you can move onward, upward in the program. As always, any questions that emerge between now and next week, feel free to email me Next week, instead of having our live Zoom session, I'll just be available via email for you to ask any last minute questions about the final assessment. Even after this class ends, if you have any programmatic questions that you would like to ask me, I was department chair for 10 years and grad advisor before that. So I'm more than happy to answer any programmatic questions that you may have. Any immediate questions about the program or any courses to take, and Dr. Matthews is our current graduate advisor and does a really nice job with that type of a role. All righty. Okay, I'll get this recording up on our Beachboard site no later than tomorrow morning. Are there any final questions or anything at all before we call it a night and call it a course? Okay. All right, if not, thank you very much for being in these sessions and for watching the recordings. It's been a pleasure working with you, and I look forward to grading your last 2 assignments, and we'll get your final grades ready to go by October 14th. So thanks, everyone. It's been a pleasure, and I wish everyone a great rest of the semester and great success in the future of the program. So take care.